All right, let's get into it. Today, we are tackling a massive topic, one of the most defining periods of the entire 20th century, the Cold War. We're going to look at how it started and what happened when the world order it created just fell apart.
So, first things first. To really get a grip on the Cold War, you gotta ask, why did the world even split like this? How did we get here? Well, this story actually starts at the very end of another huge, devastating war.
So World War II ends, and out of the ashes, two major victors rise to the top. But here's the thing, they weren't exactly friends. A totally new global power structure was being built, and it was one that would pretty much define the next 50 years.
Think about it. After years of brutal fighting, the old European empires, Britain, France, Germany, they were basically in ruins. This left a giant power vacuum. And into that empty space stepped two very, very different nations, both ready to take over the world stage.
So, the end of the war wasn't just about peace treaties and rebuilding, it was a complete reset. It reshaped the entire planet and, believe it or not, created the perfect storm for a brand new kind of global showdown.
In this new showdown, it was different. It wasn't really fought with armies clashing on a battlefield. Nope. This was a war of ideas, of influence, and, lurking in the background, the constant terrifying threat of a real war.
Okay, so what was this all about, really? At its core, the Cold War was a massive clash between two totally opposite ways of running a country. You had the United States with its capitalism and democracy, all about individual freedom, private businesses, free markets. And on the other side, you had the Soviet Union with socialism and communism, where the government controlled everything and the collective was more important than the individual. These two systems weren't just different, they were fundamentally completely opposed to each other. They couldn't just get along.
And, as you can see here, it didn't take long for these ideological battles to turn into real-world military standoffs. The world basically split right down the middle, creating two massive, heavily armed camps staring each other down.
This is what historians and political scientists call bipolarity, or a bipolar world. You had these two poles of power, the USA and the USSR, and pretty much every other country on Earth was pressured to pick a side. It turned everything, even small local conflicts, into a high-stakes global chess match.
So with all this tension simmering for years, well, it was bound to boil over. There were these incredibly scary moments, these flashpoints of crisis, where the whole world just held its breath, absolutely terrified that this Cold War was about to turn hot.
And the single most dangerous moment of the entire period? It happened in 1962, right on America's doorstep, just off the coast of Florida.
For 13 nail-biting days, the whole world was glued to the news. You had Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba pointed right at the U.S. You had an American naval blockade stopping their ships. I mean, how much closer could you possibly get to a full-blown nuclear war? This was the brink.
So why didn't anyone push the button? It all came down to one terrifyingly simple idea: deterrence. Both the US and the Soviet Union had so many nuclear weapons that they knew if one side launched, the other would launch right back, and, well, that would be the end of everything. They called it mutually assured destruction. It's an insane paradox, right? The very weapons that could destroy the world were also the only things preventing a war.
But you can't keep that kind of pressure up forever, and one of these superpowers just couldn't take the strain. After decades of this standoff, the Soviet system started to show some serious cracks, not from the outside, but from within.
Then, in 1985, a new kind of leader takes over in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. He looked around and saw that the system was flat out failing. So he decided to try and save it by introducing two radical, game-changing new policies. He called them Glasnost, which means openness, and Perestroika, which means restructuring. The whole point was to breathe new life into the dying Soviet system, but in a massive twist of irony, these reforms actually ended up speeding up its total collapse.
And what's so fascinating here is that it wasn't just one thing that brought the Soviet Union down. It was a perfect storm of problems. You had a stagnant economy that was just being crushed by the cost of the arms race. You had people who were desperate for the kinds of freedoms they saw in the West. And then you had Gorbachev's reforms, which kind of took the lid off that whole pressure cooker.
And once things started to unravel, they unraveled fast. I mean, incredibly fast. The Berlin Wall comes down in '89. That was the big symbolic moment. And just 2 short years after that, the entire Soviet Union was just gone, wiped off the map.
But the collapse of a superpower isn't a neat and tidy ending.
It didn't just end the Cold War. For millions and millions of people, it kicked off a period of painful, chaotic, and totally unpredictable change.
So how do you go from a completely state-controlled communist system to a free market capitalist one overnight? Well, the World Bank and the IMF recommended a radical approach. It got the nickname shock therapy.
And this shock therapy? Well, it was so abrupt and so messy that one critic famously called it history's biggest garage sale.
A garage sale? Why that name? Well, just look at the fallout. Huge state-owned industries, the entire industrial backbone of the country, were sold off for practically nothing, often to a handful of well-connected insiders. The currency, the ruble, collapsed. The entire social safety net was ripped apart. It led to massive inequality and real, honest-to-goodness hardship for millions of regular people.
So what did we get at the end of all this? The end of the Cold War didn't create some new balanced world order. Instead, it created what's called a unipolar world, with the United States as the one and only remaining superpower. But that era seems to be changing too, and that leaves us with a really big question for today. If the bipolar world is gone and the unipolar world is fading, what kind of world do we live in now? What comes next?